Well, what is going on, football fans? Back at it with another New York Giants video. Being that the New York Giants now have kind of figured out who the coaches are going to be for this football team. We know the defensive coordinator, offensive coordinator, head coach. I think it's appropriate to at least start to dive into the draft a little bit. I'm not going to do like individual, player breakdown videos in terms of their strengths, weaknesses, how they fit the Giants, probably for another couple of weeks until such time the Super Bowl is over, maybe even after the Combine when we get a better look into these prospects. And then I'll really hit home with some of the prospects that I could see the New York Giants taking both early and later in this year's draft. The New York Giants have a ton of needs going into this draft. However, I think it's a pretty telling sound clip came out yesterday from Joe Schoen when he was on the New York Giants Huddle podcast that I'm going to play for you guys in where the New York Giants at least may be leaning in this year's draft. Of course, it's a guessing game. That's what makes the draft so fun. We don't know what the New York Giants are going to ultimately do. We could only speculate. The Giants have a ton of needs, but I think we could all agree, based off of what Joe Schoen said in his opening press conference, that he's going to at least prioritize certain positions. The offensive line certainly being one of them. But we have a lot of other needs. You have edge rushers, cornerbacks, so on and so forth. You could also look at Don Wink Martindale's scheme, like I said yesterday, and at least speculate as to what players or positions they may be looking to prioritize in this year's draft. The Giants, we know, need an edge rusher, and they're certainly going to need strong coverage, whether that be a coverage linebacker, whether that be a lockdown corner, and the Giants could go a lot of ways with that second pick. But when you talk about positional value, something that Dave Gettleman was knocked for in terms of basically ignoring that with a lot of his draft picks. You took Saquon Barkley second overall. Positional value would suggest that's not a very good pick, and I'll get into the specifics in this video as to why that may be. He also took a defensive tackle 17th overall. The same thing could be said there, being that it's not one of the most sought-after positions and not one of the highest paid positions. The reason why taking a tackle, an edge, or a quarterback early on is even more beneficial than, say, a center, a guard, a safety, would be due to the fact that you get such a discount. It's not based off position on the rookie salaries. It's based off of draft slot. So a quarterback that makes, on his second contract, traditionally he's going to make $45 to $50 million. It is a huge benefit to be able to pay that guy, say, an average cost of $7 or $8 million in the fifth draft slot by comparison to a center. $7 or $8 million in the fifth draft slot, right? Because that's basically the market for centers on their second contract. So I think that's why, at least from an economical standpoint, which is what Shane goes on to talk about, and I'm going to play the clip in a second, it makes that much more sense to go with a tackle and potentially an edge with the New York Giants' first two picks in this year's draft. That's where I'm leaning as of now, where the New York Giants may go, if not an edge, a cornerback. That's not to rule out the possibility of the New York Giants taking Kyle Hamilton or even a Tyler Linderbaum. However, I think it becomes much more realistic that they could go with an interior offensive lineman if they were able to find a trade partner and, say, trade out of the top 10 picks in this year's draft. If they take a center, if they take a guard, I'm not going to cry about it. You come to my channel, I fully recognize the offensive line is a huge problem for this football team. However, I could understand the logic behind not, waiting till round 2 to take your center or take your guard, being that positional value has to be factored in. If you look at the history of the NFL over the last 10 drafts, and I may have been off by one or two numbers. I briefly went over the last 10 drafts. The quarterback, tackle, edge, and wide receiver position makeup, I think it was 52 or 53 of the 70 picks over those 10 drafts, in terms of the first 7 overall selections, which is where the New York Giants are going to be selecting. The quarterback, I believe, was 17 or 18. The edge was about 15. The tackle was 10. The wide receiver was 9. After that, it was 4 or lower at every other position. The safety only had 2. The center had 0. And the guard, I believe, had 2 as well, which would probably be the 2 positions the New York Giants could potentially be looking at if they weren't going to go with one of the more highly valued positions. But first, let's jump into the positional value quote that came out from Joe Judge that I thought was pretty telling as to what the New York Giants may be leaning in this year's draft, and then we'll dive a little bit further into positional value. This coming out from Joe Schoen yesterday when on the Giants Huddle podcast, talking about the Senior Bowl recap and draft preview.
Believe in the concept of premium positions. You look at the guys in the top of the free agent market, certain positions generally get more money. You look at positions top 10 in the draft, certain positions are targeted more pass rushers, offensive tackle. Do you believe in that concept, or are you more, if the player is really good, I don't really care where he plays.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I do because on the market to get a starting corner, a good starting corner is going to be $20 million. Get a good defensive end, it's going to cost you 25. A good receiver, 20. A good quarterback, these guys are getting $45-50 million here pretty soon. So I do think that's important. Left tackles. So, when you're paying that premium and you can get a player that's cross-controlled for 4 to 5 years, if it's a first rounder, 5 years, if you do the 5th-year option, I think you have to look at that from an economic standpoint when you're trying to build the team.
So he basically just said it there. He told you the positions, and I'm going to go over the charts and show you what these guys make on an average per year basis and why economically it does make a lot of sense. He talked about the quarterback position. He talked about the wide receiver position. He talked about the edge. He talked about the tackle position, left tackle specifically. But when you look at it, right tackles make nearly as much as left tackles do. And I think he mentioned one other position. What you saw he didn't mention were running backs, safeties, interior offensive linemen, because in terms of what they make on their second contracts, it's not even close to that of what a tackle, quarterback, or edge rusher make. So if he goes by what he said, and he does factor that in strongly, which is basically what he said, you have to think he's at least leaning, in an ideal world, going with a tackle and potentially an edge rusher with those 2 picks for the New York Giants. If not edge, a cornerback, because we all know, top-tier cornerbacks do make a lot of money on the second contract. But I wanted to go over a couple of things with you guys, just really look over how much these guys actually make. This is the franchise tag. This might have been a couple of years ago, but regardless, it hits home with the point in terms of positional value. And he did talk about specifically how much they make. Like some people on Twitter pointed to the fact that on WAR, safeties are much higher. He talked about specifically how much they make in terms of what, how much they cost on a second contract and the benefit to taking, say, a tackle, edge, or quarterback. This is what they make on the franchise tag. Quarterbacks are, of course, the highest at nearly $30 million. Wide receivers are close at 19. You have defensive tackles, which are about 17. Defensive ends at 17.5. Linebackers at 18.5. I think they're probably combining outside linebackers, edge, with those numbers. Cornerbacks are 17.5. Offensive linemen are only 16.5, but what you'll notice is there isn't an individual category for centers and guards. It's kind of all lumped together in terms of the projected franchise tags. I would think tackles would be significantly higher than that of guards and centers, and we'll get more into that with my second thing that I wanted to pull up for you guys. But what you'll notice at the bottom of this list, you have safeties, you have tight ends, you have running backs, and of course kickers and punters. So if you're going off positional value, you're probably not looking at one of those players if you're taking that into account. Of course, if you're blown away, like the New York Giants were with Saquon Barkley, like the New York Jets were with Jamal Adams, that may not prohibit you from taking said player. In terms of what they make in the NFL on average, in terms of positional value, quarterbacks are significantly higher than anybody else. They're nearly double the second highest paid position on average. Quarterbacks make $8.4 million on average. Of course, that's taking into account backups, third-string quarterbacks. Left tackles being second at nearly $5 million. Then you have the edge at 4.3, right tackle at 4.2, then wide receiver, then interior defensive line. Then you get to your interior offensive linemen. Centers are 7th, cornerbacks are 8, guards are 9, safeties are 10, and tight ends are 11. You still haven't even gotten to running backs yet. But I just wanted to really point out and hit home with what positional value means in terms of how much they make financially and where it may be at least hinting where the New York Giants may be going with these first 2 picks. Of course, there's still a lot of questions. We don't know if the New York Giants are going to trade down. I think it's something that they at least have to look into if there's a trade partner out there. And a lot of that's going to depend on how these quarterbacks are evaluated. And if the New York Giants are not looking to go quarterback, well, those picks may have a lot of value. If a guy like Malik Willis is looked highly at by a team, say, like the Minnesota Vikings, and they were looking to trade up from 12 to 5, you may be able to get a lot for him. And if you trade down to 12, that opens up a lot more possibilities. But if the New York Giants are staying at 5 and 7, if you ask me right now, if I had to guess, I think you're looking at a tackle, and you're looking potentially at either an edge rusher or a cornerback, especially being that Shane sounds like he's going to take positional value highly into consideration. We'll have to wait and see how it all plays out, but I just want to get a video out on that. I thought it was interesting hearing Shane talk about that topic. I know it's been a widely talked about topic. Well, Dave Gettleman was the general manager of the New York Giants, and there's going to be a lot of speculation as to where the New York Giants may be going. As always, if you like what you watch, please subscribe, drop a comment, maybe give me a little thumbs up. Cheers.